Prepare to embark on a gripping journey through one of the most complex and enduring conflicts in human history, the Israel-Palestine conflict. This isn't just a tale of land disputes and political strife. It's a spiritual saga steeped in ancient prophecies, divine promises, and profound emotional scars. What if the roots of this enmity stretch back thousands of years to the very figures of Abraham and his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael? Can the echoes of biblical narratives truly shape the course of modern geopolitics? As we peel back the layers of this bitter rivalry, we'll explore the fervent claims of both Jews and Palestinians to the land they hold dear, examining the pivotal moments that ignited this fire. Discover how the prophecies of old intertwine with the realities of today, and how the sacred city of Jerusalem becomes a flashpoint for global tension. What does it all mean for the future? Buckle up as we illuminate the spiritual warfare, political machinations, and human stories that define this conflict, promising insights that will challenge your understanding of faith, identity, and destiny. Don't miss this deep dive into a narrative that transcends borders and beckons the hearts of millions. Are you ready to uncover the truth? First, let us explore: what covenants has God established? Why have these covenants led to these endless conflicts? The roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict trace back thousands of years to the Bible's account of Abraham and his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Abraham, considered the patriarch of both Jews and Arabs, was promised by God that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan. However, the story of who would inherit this promise is where the divide begins. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael, born to Hagar, an Egyptian slave, and Isaac, born to his wife Sarah in their old age. According to the Bible, God's covenant would be passed through Isaac and his descendants, making Isaac the father of Jacob, whose descendants became the Israelites. This divine promise of land and blessing to Isaac and his descendants is central to the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. However, Ishmael also received a blessing from God, promising that he would become the father of a great nation. Ishmael's descendants are traditionally understood to be the Arab people, which includes the Palestinians. This ancestral division sets the stage for the conflict, as both Jews and Arabs claim Abraham as their forefather and see the land of Canaan as part of their heritage. The heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict is the claim to the land of Israel, which both sides consider their rightful homeland. For Jews, the land is not just a place to live. It's a fulfillment of a divine promise. God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob includes the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel and Palestine, as an everlasting inheritance for their descendants. This promise is reaffirmed throughout the Old Testament, particularly in God's covenants with Moses and King David. The re-establishment of Israel in 1948, and which prophecy is gradually being fulfilled. The Bible also speaks of the restoration of Israel in the end times, with prophecies in Ezekiel and Isaiah describing a future where Israel is regathered from exile and restored to its land. These prophecies were seen by many as being fulfilled when Israel became a nation after nearly 2,000 years of exile following the horrors of the Holocaust. For Palestinians, many of whom trace their lineage to Ishmael and view themselves as descendants of the ancient Canaanites, the land is their ancestral home as well. The land is their ancestral home, claimed by both sides, creating a narrative of belonging that spans centuries. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 marks one of the most pivotal and controversial moments in modern Middle Eastern history. It was a moment of jubilation for the Jewish people, symbolizing the fulfillment of ancient prophecies and the restoration of their homeland after centuries of exile. However, for Palestinians, This moment signifies the beginning of an enduring displacement and loss, sparking what they call the Nakba, or catastrophe. The contrast between jubilation and catastrophe highlights the profound divide in how this moment is remembered by both peoples. Understanding the profound impact of the establishment of Israel requires a deep dive into the historical, political, and emotional elements that have shaped the Israel-Palestine conflict as we know it today. The modern conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine began to take shape in the late 19th century with the rise of the Zionist movement, founded by Theodor Herzl. Zionism advocated for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in response to centuries of persecution, including pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia. Herzl's vision began to take root, planting the seeds for the Jewish homeland in Palestine and setting the stage for the complex conflict to come. Palestine at that time was under Ottoman control and home to a predominant Arab Muslim population with smaller Christian and Jewish communities. However, the Zionist movement viewed Palestine as the historic homeland of the Jewish people, based on biblical claims and historical ties to the land of Israel. From the early 1900s, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased steadily, fueled by Zionist aspirations and the growing dangers Jews faced in Europe. Jewish pioneers established communities, farms, and schools, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the modern state of Israel. This immigration was further accelerated by the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British government expressed its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The declaration, while welcomed by Jews, sowed the seeds of conflict with the Arab inhabitants of the region. They viewed the declaration as a betrayal by the British, who had previously promised Arab independence in exchange for support against the Ottoman Empire during World War I. The British promises to both sides laid the foundation for a conflict that would shape the region for decades to come. After the defeat of the Ottomans, Britain was given control over Palestine under a League of Nations mandate, formalizing its role in administering the region. During this period, Jewish immigration and land purchases continued to increase, resulting in growing tensions between Jews and Arabs throughout the 1920s and 1930s. These tensions escalated into sporadic violence between Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine. Both groups felt a deep attachment to the land, and the competing nationalist movements, Zionism for Jews and Arab nationalism for Palestinians, began to clash more openly in the 1930s. Jewish immigration surged, particularly due to the rise of Nazi Germany. Palestinian Arabs grew increasingly alarmed, fearing that the growing Jewish population would soon dominate the land. This led to calls for limits on immigration and Jewish land purchases, culminating in the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. A widespread uprising against both the British administration and Jewish communities. The tragic events of World War II and the Holocaust added urgency to the Zionist cause. The systematic extermination of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany left the surviving Jewish population determined to create a homeland where they could live safely and free from persecution. For many Jews, Palestine was the only place that could serve as this refuge. After the war, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees, many of them Holocaust survivors, sought to immigrate to Palestine. However, the British, facing increasing Arab opposition and their own geopolitical challenges, imposed limits on Jewish immigration. This led to Jewish paramilitary organizations like the Haganah, Irgun and Lehi launching violent campaigns against British forces, demanding an end to immigration restrictions and British rule. Exhausted from the war and unable to manage the growing violence, the British referred the issue of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. The British referred the issue of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. In response to the rising violence between Jews and Arabs, the United Nations proposed a solution, the Partition Plan of 1947. The plan aimed to divide Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international administration due to its religious significance. For Jews, the partition plan was a victory, even though many felt that the land allocated to them was too small and fragmented. For Palestinians and the Arab world, the plan was seen as deeply unjust. At the time, Jews constituted only about 1/3 of the population and owned less than 7% of the land in Palestine, yet the plan gave them a majority of the territory, including some areas with large Arab populations. The Arab leadership rejected the partition plan outright, viewing it as a colonialist imposition that violated the rights of the indigenous Arab population. Jewish leaders, led by David Ben-Gurion, accepted the plan with reservations, seeing it as the best opportunity to achieve statehood. The contrasting reactions to the partition plan set the stage for the conflict that would soon erupt across the region. And what wars and occupations have occurred and are still unfolding. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate in Palestine came to an end, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The next day, armies from 5 neighboring Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria and Lebanon, invaded the new state, aiming to crush it before it could take root. This was the beginning of the Arab-Israeli War, known in Israel as the War of Independence, and to Palestinians as the Nakba. The conflict that began as a war for survival for some became, for others, a catastrophe of displacement and loss. While Israel fought for its survival, the consequences for the Palestinians were devastating. During the war, over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, either fleeing their homes out of fear or being forcibly expelled by Israeli forces. Entire Palestinian villages were depopulated and many were razed to the ground. These refugees fled to neighboring countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria and Egypt, or to the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The causes of this mass displacement are still hotly debated. Israeli historians argue that many Palestinians fled voluntarily, anticipating a swift Arab victory, while Palestinian scholars emphasize the expulsions carried out by Jewish militias during military campaigns, such as Plan Dalet. Regardless of the causes, the result was the same: an enormous population of stateless Palestinians and a deep sense of injustice that has fueled the conflict for decades. A deep sense of injustice has fueled the conflict for decades. The armistice agreements that ended the war left Israel in control of 78% of historic Palestine. The remaining territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, were controlled by Jordan and Egypt respectively until the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel captured these areas. The Nakba is not just a historical event for Palestinians, it is the defining trauma of their national identity. The Nakba is not just a memory, but a living trauma that continues to define Palestinian identity today. The displacement of 1948 created a Palestinian refugee crisis that persists to this day, with millions of Palestinians living in refugee camps in neighboring Arab countries, in the West Bank and Gaza, or scattered across the globe. The right of return, the demand that Palestinian refugees and their descendants be allowed to return to the homes they fled or were expelled from in 1948, remains one of the core issues of the Israel-Palestine conflict. For Palestinians, the right of return is not just a legal demand, but a deeply emotional connection to the homes and lands lost in 1948. The right of return remains a core issue that continues to fuel the Israel-Palestine conflict. For Palestinians, 1948 represents the loss of their homeland, the destruction of their society, and the beginning of their statelessness. Every year on May 15th, Palestinians commemorate Nakba Day, mourning the loss of their land and demanding recognition of their rights. The memory of the Nakba is a source of deep resentment and fuels the desire for justice, restitution, and statehood. The desire for justice, restitution, and statehood remains at the heart of the Palestinian struggle. The events of 1948 laid the foundation for the modern Israel-Palestine conflict. The establishment of Israel and the displacement of the Palestinian people created two opposing national narratives, one of triumph and restoration for Jews, and one of catastrophe and dispossession for Palestinians. These competing historical memories have shaped the collective identities of both peoples. These narratives have made the path to peace extraordinarily difficult. The Six-Day War of 1967 is one of the most decisive and transformative events in the modern Middle East, reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the region. For Israel, the war resulted in a swift, overwhelming victory that expanded its territory and solidified its position in the region. For the Palestinians and neighboring Arab states, the war marked the beginning of an extended Israeli occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, and Golan Heights. The war became a source of enduring conflict and international tension, laying the groundwork for the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. The Six-Day War did not arise out of a vacuum, but was the culmination of escalating tensions between Israel and its neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. Following the creation of Israel in 1948, these tensions were heightened by several key factors. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War had left deep scars. Arab states refused to recognize Israel's right to exist, adding to the growing animosity. Arab nationalism aimed at uniting Arab states against Israel, fueling further conflict. Another precursor to the Six-Day War was the Suez Crisis of 1956, during which Israel, in coordination with Britain and France, invaded Egypt following Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. Although Israel withdrew under international pressure, the war deepened animosity between Israel and Egypt. The war laid the groundwork for future conflict. The animosity between Israel and Egypt, fueled by the Suez Crisis, was a key factor in the build-up to the Six-Day War. In May 1967, Nasser escalated the conflict by closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, effectively blockading Israel's port of Eilat and cutting off vital maritime access to the Red Sea. Israel viewed this as an act of war, and international efforts to mediate the situation failed. Faced with increasing threats from its neighbors, Israel felt surrounded and vulnerable. With diplomatic efforts failing and the blockade tightening, Israel braced for the possibility of war. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, marking the start of the Six-Day War. Israel's Air Force led the offensive, launching Operation Focus, a meticulously planned surprise attack that destroyed the majority of Egypt's air force while it was still on the ground. This left Egypt's military crippled and ensured Israel's air superiority throughout the conflict. With Egypt's air force destroyed, Israel gained air superiority, setting the stage for its rapid advance throughout the conflict. Over the next 6 days, Israel fought on multiple fronts against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, achieving stunning victories. By the end of the war on June 10, 1967, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, seized control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and captured the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel had tripled the size of its territory in just 6 days, changing the region's political map dramatically. With the borders redrawn and the region transformed, the war's aftermath would shape the Middle East for decades to come. The capture of East Jerusalem, including the Old City and sites sacred to Judaism, Christianity and Islam, had profound religious and political significance. The victory was celebrated in Israel as a miracle, cementing the state's military prowess in the region. The Six-Day War created a new reality. Israel now controlled significant Arab populations in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. This marked the beginning of what is known as the Israeli occupation of these territories. Israel's capture of the West Bank and Gaza brought over 1 million Palestinians under Israeli military rule. This occupation has been one of the most contentious issues in the Israel-Palestine conflict, as Palestinians in these territories seek independence and the establishment of a Palestinian state. The capture of East Jerusalem was perhaps the most symbolic victory for Israel, as the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, came under Israeli control for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. While the victory was celebrated in Israel, it marked the beginning of new challenges and tensions that continue to define the region today. However, for Palestinians and the broader Arab world, the loss of East Jerusalem was a major blow, as the city is also home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, two of the holiest sites in Islam. The loss of East Jerusalem is not only a territorial loss, but a symbolic one, marking a major setback for the Palestinian national cause. The capture of the Golan Heights from Syria has remained a strategic military advantage for Israel, providing a buffer zone against potential attacks from the north. However, the Syrian government continues to demand its return, making the Golan a key point of contention in Israeli-Syrian relations. The war exacerbated the Palestinian refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were displaced from the newly occupied territories. These displaced Palestinians have never been allowed to return, adding to the already significant number of refugees created during the 1948 Nakba. The inability to return has fueled resentment and further complicated peace efforts. The unresolved refugee crisis remains one of the greatest obstacles to lasting peace in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Israel's victory in the Six-Day War was a result of not only its military strategy, but also the support and backing of various international allies. While Israel's primary military backer was the United States, other Western countries played key roles in providing funding, weapons, and diplomatic backing. Although the US did not directly engage in the Six-Day War, it provided critical military and financial support to Israel in the lead-up to the conflict. The support from international allies played a crucial role in ensuring Israel's preparedness for the conflict and contributed to its swift victory. In the aftermath of the war, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 242, which called for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict and for the recognition of every state in the area to live in peace. While the resolution became the basis for future peace negotiations, its ambiguous wording, especially regarding the extent of Israeli withdrawal, left it open to multiple interpretations. To this day, the status of the occupied territories remains a central issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Though Resolution 242 laid the foundation for peace negotiations, the unresolved status of the occupied territories continues to fuel conflict and complicate efforts toward a lasting resolution. In the aftermath of the war, Israeli settlements began to sprout in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. These settlements, viewed by the international community as illegal under international law, have expanded significantly over the decades, creating a demographic and political reality that complicates any potential for a two-state solution. The Six-Day War also catalyzed Palestinian nationalism with the rise of movements like Fatah and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. The rise of Palestinian nationalism marked a new chapter in the conflict, fueling both resistance and hope for independence. The occupation became a source of daily hardship for Palestinians and a rallying cry for resistance movements. The Six-Day War is more than just a military conflict. It's the event that reshaped the modern Middle East and defined the parameters of the Israel-Palestine conflict that persists today. Israel's rapid victory and subsequent occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem set the stage for decades of tension, resistance, and cycles of violence. The legacy of the Six-Day War continues to shape the lives of millions as the region struggles between conflict and the hope for peace. Through these wars, what spiritual perspectives are being clearly manifested? At the heart of the spiritual view of the Israel-Palestine conflict is the covenant that God made with Abraham and, by extension, with his descendants. This covenant is not only about the people of Israel, but also about a specific piece of land, the land of Canaan, which God promised to Abraham's descendants as an everlasting inheritance. In Genesis, God promises Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." This divine promise of land is reiterated in Genesis, where God specifies the boundaries of this land, stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. It was given to Abraham's descendants through Isaac, not as a temporary possession, but as an everlasting possession. This promise forms the foundation of Jewish claims to the land of Israel and Jerusalem, as they see themselves as the heirs of this covenant. Through their covenant with God, the Jewish people view their connection to Israel and Jerusalem as eternal and unbreakable. For many Christians, this covenant remains active and significant in the modern era. The belief is that God's promises are eternal and that the land of Israel was given to the Jewish people as part of his divine plan. Thus, any conflict over this land is not just about politics or territory. It's seen as an attempt to undermine God's covenant and thwart his plan for Israel and the world. For many, supporting Israel is seen as aligning with God's plan, adding a spiritual dimension to the geopolitical struggle. Throughout the Old Testament, there are numerous prophecies about the scattering of the Jewish people, their exile, and their eventual restoration to the land of Israel. These prophecies speak of a time when Israel would be regathered from the nations and restored to their homeland, a process that many Christians believe began in the 20th century. To many, the restoration of Israel is seen as a sign that God's promises are being fulfilled in our time. One of the most significant prophecies comes from the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel, the prophet has a vision of a valley filled with dry bones, representing the people of Israel. God tells Ezekiel that these bones will be brought back to life, a metaphor for the resurrection of the nation of Israel after centuries of exile. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones: "I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life." The vision of Ezekiel represents the rebirth of the nation of Israel, a people brought back to life after centuries of exile. For many believers, the creation of the modern state of Israel in 1948 is a direct fulfillment of this prophecy. After nearly 2,000 years of exile, following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, the Jewish people were regathered to their ancient homeland, just as the Bible foretold. This was seen as a miraculous event, one that signaled the beginning of the end times timeline. For many, the establishment of Israel marked not just a political victory, but a divine milestone in the unfolding of God's plan for the world. So why has Jerusalem become the center of the conflict? If Israel is central to God's prophetic plan, then Jerusalem is the crown jewel of that plan. The city of Jerusalem holds unparalleled significance in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But its biblical importance is especially highlighted in prophecy. Jerusalem is described as the city where God has placed his name and where he will dwell with his people. Jerusalem stands as a symbol of God's promise and presence, a place where the divine meets the earthly. In 2 Chronicles, God says, "But now I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there, and I have chosen David to rule my people, Israel." Throughout the Bible, Jerusalem is depicted as the focal point of God's activity on earth. It's the place where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac. Jerusalem is where David established his kingdom, and where Solomon's temple stood as a symbol of God's presence among his people. In the New Testament, Jerusalem is the city where Jesus Christ was crucified and resurrected, making it central to the Christian faith as well. However, Jerusalem's role in prophecy extends beyond these historical events. The book of Zechariah speaks of Jerusalem's future role in the end times. God declares that Jerusalem will become a source of conflict and global tension in the last days. Jerusalem stands at the crossroads of history and prophecy, destined to be both a beacon of hope and a flashpoint for conflict in the last days. I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. On that day when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure them. This prophecy foretells a time when nations will rise up against Israel and attempt to take control of Jerusalem, but they will ultimately fail. This prophecy foretells a time when nations will rise up against Israel and attempt to take control of Jerusalem, but they will ultimately fail. For many Christians, the modern conflict over Jerusalem, its status as a divided city claimed by both Israelis and Palestinians, is a direct fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy. The tension surrounding Jerusalem's status remains a key issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict, with both sides claiming it as their capital. Jerusalem's divided status makes any resolution to the conflict deeply challenging. To many, the ongoing struggle over Jerusalem is not only political, but profoundly spiritual, a sign that the prophecies of Zechariah are unfolding before their eyes. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel captured East Jerusalem, including the Old City, bringing the entire city under Israeli control for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. This event is viewed by many Christians as part of the prophetic restoration of Israel, as it brought the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, back into Jewish hands. However, it also intensified the conflict with Palestinians, who see East Jerusalem as the capital of their future state. The capture of East Jerusalem remains both a fulfillment of prophecy and a flashpoint for conflict, as the city stands at the heart of two peoples' aspirations. The Bible speaks of Jerusalem's central role in the final battles of the end times. The book of Revelation and other apocalyptic texts describe a series of wars and conflicts that will culminate in Armageddon, the ultimate confrontation between the forces of good and evil. According to these prophecies, Jerusalem will be the epicenter of these final battles. Jerusalem will witness the ultimate struggle, but it will also be the place where peace is restored, fulfilling God's divine plan. In Revelation, it is written, "Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon." Armageddon derived from the Hebrew Ha-Megiddo, refers to a valley near Jerusalem, traditionally viewed as the location of the final battle between the Antichrist and the forces of God. In this battle, Jerusalem will play a critical role as the city of God, where Christ will ultimately return to defeat his enemies and establish his millennial kingdom. With his enemies defeated, Christ will reign from Jerusalem, establishing his millennial kingdom and bringing peace to the earth. For Christians who view the Israel-Palestine conflict through a prophetic lens, the ongoing struggle over Jerusalem is a sign that these end-time events are drawing near. The battle for control over the city is seen as more than just a territorial dispute. It is part of a cosmic spiritual war between the forces of good and evil. With the city at the heart of God's plan for the final redemption of the world, Jerusalem remains the epicenter of God's divine plan, where the forces of good will ultimately triumph, bringing redemption to the world. For many Christians and Jews who interpret the Israel-Palestine conflict as part of biblical prophecy, the war over the land is more than just a human conflict. It's a spiritual battle. According to this view, Satan seeks to destroy Israel and thwart God's plans for his chosen people. The rise of opposition to Israel, whether from Palestinian groups surrounding Arab nations or international critics, is often seen as part of this larger spiritual warfare. In this spiritual battle, Jerusalem stands at the center where God's plans for his people will ultimately triumph. In the book of Daniel, for instance, we read about spiritual forces influencing earthly rulers and conflicts. Daniel speaks of angelic beings battling the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece, spiritual forces that represent the earthly powers of those nations. Many believe that similar spiritual forces are at work in the modern conflict over Israel, with demonic powers attempting to undermine God's purposes. In this spiritual struggle, Jerusalem stands as both the battleground and the beacon of God's ultimate victory over evil. Furthermore, the conflict over Jerusalem is seen as a microcosm of the larger spiritual battle between God's kingdom and the forces of darkness. For Christians, this struggle is not just about national sovereignty or political boundaries. It's about the culmination of God's plan to redeem the world through Christ, who will return to rule from Jerusalem and establish his eternal kingdom. In the end, Christ will return to rule from Jerusalem, bringing peace and redemption and establishing his eternal kingdom on earth. The city of Jerusalem, with its profound religious significance, remains at the center of the political struggle. Israel's control over East Jerusalem, which Palestinians claim as the capital of their future state, has been a major sticking point in peace talks. The international community, including the United Nations, has not recognized Israeli sovereignty over East Jerusalem, viewing it as occupied territory. Jerusalem remains a city of profound religious significance and political complexity, at the heart of a conflict with no easy resolution. The two-state solution, which envisions an independent state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel, remains the most widely proposed solution to the conflict. However, decades of negotiations have failed to produce a lasting agreement, and both sides remain deeply divided over core issues. Both sides remain deeply divided over core issues such as borders, the status of Jerusalem, security arrangements, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Despite decades of efforts, the dream of two states living side by side remains elusive as deep divisions continue to block the path to lasting peace. Whether viewed through the lens of spiritual warfare or political struggle, one thing is clear: the conflict over Israel and Palestine is part of a larger story, one that has been unfolding for millennia and may continue to shape the course of world history. These competing narratives, rooted in faith, identity, and land, continue to intersect in ways that influence the world far beyond the borders of Israel and Palestine. As this story continues to unfold, it will shape not only the future of Israel and Palestine, but the course of world history. What is hidden within these wars that God wants to convey to us? Subscribe to the Bible Story Discoveries channel to explore with us many more mysteries still concealed in the Bible. Thank you for watching our video.